Shall I say something calming not from Howard, just an FYI?
By Joseph Haydn, and an overture by Aaron Copland later on. And that's all in the next hour of great classical music.
Okay, welcome to the second Queer Politics webinar. I may just ask Gabe or Andrew to just reassure me that I'm being seen and heard.
It works, yes.
Excellent, good. So glad you could join us for this second seminar. We had a lot of great feedback last week on the first seminar, which was wonderful. Today, we're really fortunate to welcome Andrew Flores of American University. He is going to talk to us about a project that he's been working on with a number of colleagues dealing with the criminal victimization of LGBTQ people in America, which of course is a not only fascinating but very important topic at this and every other time. I think he's going to reveal to us a lot of data and information and analysis that should be pretty eye-opening even to people working in the field. Let me just remind you to mute your audio. And if you would like to ask a question, just send me a chat message. Say that you'd like to be put on the question list. Didn't have to tell me what your question is, but you can send me your desire to ask a question, and then I'll let you know just before it's question time that you're up. Normally, we're running these presentations around about half an hour, so we will expect to do questions and discussion in the second half of the webinar. So without further ado, welcome all again, and I will hand it over to Andrew, who will take us through the findings of the National Crime Victimization Survey as they speak to LGBTQ Americans. And so thank you, Andrew. Over to you.
Thank you. Sorry, I had to find the button to unmute myself. Thanks everyone for coming in and seeing this presentation. As Andy said, my name is Andrew Flores. I'm a political scientist at American University, but I'm also a research affiliate with the Williams Institute at the UCLA School of Law, which has pulled my research into more interdisciplinary directions, this project is one of those endeavors. Sad to say that we're discussing such a potentially depressing topic toward the end of Pride Month, but I think these findings are really compelling and very important to present. Without further ado, I do want to acknowledge my co-investigators on this project. We have Lynn Langton, who's at RTI International, Elon Meyer, Adam Romero, Bianca Wilson, and Jody Herman. Many of them affiliates or former affiliates with the Williams Institute at the UCLA School of Law. To let me foreground this discussion to talk a little bit about just federal data collection efforts on sexual orientation and gender identity. In the Obama era, there was an established federal interagency working group that was focused on discussing and then developing ways to improve the measurement of sexuality and gender in federal surveys. And this group was convened by the Office of Management and Budget. In addition to having convenings and meetings, they also published a few reports reviewing the current federal data collection efforts and then also mapping out an important research agenda for what the federal government could do to reveal kind of the lived realities of sexual and gender diverse populations. This working group has since been defunct under the Trump administration. And as far as I know, this group has not met in a very long time. And so kind of all of this research effort has kind of lost steam under the current administration. As of 2016, here are federal surveys that collect details about sexual orientation and gender identity. And so you have the National Health Interview Survey, you have a variety of other surveys, and importantly, the one that we'll be looking at today will be the National Crime Victimization Survey, which began in July 2016, documenting people's sexuality and gender. So there are two primary sources for federal crime data statistics. One is from the FBI Uniform Crime Report, which reports out victimizations that are reported to the police, which can have its limitations, as you can understand that victimizations sometimes do not go reported. And so the other source of federal data is from the Bureau of Justice Statistics National Crime Victimization Survey. And in both of these data sets, historically, they've only documented bias-motivated crimes by sexual orientation and by gender identity. And do not explicitly say measure a person's sexuality or gender across any varieties of types of crime. So this has led to a very little understanding of victimization of LGBT populations in the United States. But we do have a couple data points that kind of indicate that disparities may exist. So the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs documented 1,036 incidents of violence and harassment and 28 homicides, with 68% of those homicides being transgender victims. The CDC published a report that showed quite starkly that bisexual women were at a disproportionate risk of sexual violence and rape. But outside of those two studies, there's a little bit less even known. A recent law review article by Jordan Blair Woods says, quote, "With respect to victimization, most studies and available data on LGBT victims involves hate crimes, an undoubtedly important area of LGBT victimization. There is little available data, however, on the potentially broader set of non-hate motivated circumstances under which LGBT people become victims of crime. Accordingly, left in the shadows are the more nuanced ways in which LGBT discrimination can leave LGBT people vulnerable to a host of harmful personal and property crimes." So let's take a look at the NCVS. So this is the questions that the NCVS added to its demographic questionnaire. To be clear about what is the NCVS first, the NCVS is a large population-based study that is a household survey. And then once households are sampled, every individual above the age of 12 years or older is interviewed and impaneled into this survey for 3.5 years. and then it's a rotating cycle of interviews. And so households and all individuals within those households are interviewed to document their experiences of violence and crime every 6 months. It's a very complex survey, and it produces and is documented in 3 distinct data sets: one for the household, one for the individual, and then also one for incidents of violence and crime. So on the demographic questionnaire, so this is asked of every individual aged 16 or older. These questions were asked. So for sexual orientation, it was which of the following best represents how you think of yourself: lesbian or gay, straight that is not lesbian or gay, bisexual or something else. Then they ask also a person's gender assigned at birth. So what sex were you assigned at birth on your original birth certificate? And then they ask about current gender identity. Do you currently describe yourself as male, female, or transgender? This question approach is known as the 2-step measure of gender identity, where you identify people who are transgender who both self-identify as trans, or they identify that they have a current gender identity that is different from their gender that was assigned at birth. And so we have, so that's how we're operationalizing that construct for this presentation. So let's just look at some basic breakdowns. So here is the percentages of sexual orientation and gender. So here we see that lesbians make up 0.6% of the sample, gay men 0.8% of the sample, bisexual men 0.5, bisexual men 0.2, and then you have large portions that are straight women and straight men. And we see that 0.1% of the sample is transgender, about evenly split in terms of gender assigned at birth. This ultimately produces a prevalence estimate of 2.1% of individuals being a sexual and gender minority, and 94.8% being a non-sexual gender minority. And then also we have about 3.1% of what we have termed the unknown other category. And that unknown other category are the individuals who said something else as it relates to sexuality, or responded that they didn't know what their current gender identity was on the gender identity measure. And I'll be presenting primary data on the sexual gender minority and non-sexual gender minority categories. We have dug into that 3rd category and looked at it, and there haven't been any distinctive patterns that we've been able to identify with that subgroup. So, so research for a different day. But we have looked into it. Oh, I should note, we have a series of projects and papers that are coming out of this. One paper is in the advanced stages of peer review. We were resubmitted and should be receiving a decision in the hopefully next few days. So, so you should be seeing some of these statistics and data in the press, so that way you can reference them and hopefully cite them as necessary. So for today's presentation, I'll be presenting for you some victimization rates, as well as characteristics of victimization, such as if incidents were reported to the police, if they were suspected to be a hate crime, or if the incident was classified as a hate crime, among a variety of other characteristics. So before presenting you the results, I know that you may be eager. Let me first talk about different types of victimization that the Bureau of Justice Statistics defines when it produces reports based on the NCBS. So there are broadly, there are two broad categories of crime. There are personal victimizations and there are property victimizations. Personal victimizations are acts of violence or threats of violence toward a person, an individual. So there are, as a subcategory of personal victimizations, there are victimizations that are serious violence, and serious violence includes incidents of rape or sexual assault, robbery, aggravated assault, or acts of violence that involve weapons. Simple assault are all other types of violence that do not necessarily fall within that serious violent category. Additionally, serious violence, a crime is categorized as serious violence if more than 2 days was necessary of hospitalization as a result of the crime. simple assaults, less than 2 days of hospitalization if there was an injury. And then also they categorize crimes whether or not they involve injury, and also if it's an act of serious and violence that resulted within an injury. The Bureau of Justice Statistics also commonly reports the relationship between the victim and the offender. And offenders can be well known to the victim, and well known includes intimate partners, relatives, or other people that the victim knows well. It could be a casual acquaintance. This is an individual whom the victim knows, say, by name, but doesn't say anything much more than say hi in passing. The offender can also be a perfect stranger. And then also there are incidents in which the victim does not know who at all might the offender have been. When it comes to property victimization, often looked at are acts of burglary, motor vehicle theft, and then other types of property victimization. So the data will be analyzed. I'm going to be analyzing the pooled 2017-2018 public use files. And of course, for the stats folks, we're applying all the complex survey designs in order to achieve proper point and standard error estimates. And then of course, they'll be doing some tests of independence and t-tests and some regression models. Most of the results I'll be presenting for you today are going to be in the bivariate context, but in the multivariate context, controlling for a variety of other factors, we see across all varieties of crime, these disparities kind of maintain themselves. And that's all, and I put it, say, here in SI, it's in supporting information in a variety of other tables that won't be in this presentation. So here's what we learned. So let's first take a look at demographics. Since the sample is large, we may see some statistically significant differences, even though substantively those differences are not that large. And so here's just breaking down characteristics of sexual and gender minorities and non-sexual gender minorities by different demographic traits. And so we see an overall quite even distribution on gender. And we do see a kind of similar distribution between SGM and non-SGM as it relates to race or ethnicity. We do see a slightly larger percent of sexual and gender minorities identifying as multiracial. But other than that, the differences do not seem to be quite large. Continuing with demographics, when it comes to age, the age distribution does suggest that sexual and gender minorities are younger. You see that we have about over 60% of the sexual and gender minorities are between 18 and 49 years of age. And only 7% are aged 65 years or older. And what's interesting is that if you actually looked at this by sexual orientation subgroups, that bisexual men and women tend to be more prevalent in the 16 to 24-year-old range, whereas gay men and lesbians are more prevalent in the 25 to 49-year-old range. And so there is an age difference among sexual and gender minorities in terms of identifying as bisexual versus gay or lesbian, which I think is fascinating for a variety of reasons. If you look at the education breakdown, we do see quite a lot of similarity. Though non-sexual gender minorities do have a higher percent of just obtaining a high school, being a high school graduate, where sexual gender minorities tend to have a slightly higher percent pursuing higher education, having a bachelor's degree or a postgraduate degree. In terms of marital status, sexual and gender minorities, 64% have never been married, compared to 29.7% of non-sexual gender minorities. And then also you can see that about 1/4 of sexual and gender minorities are married, compared to about half of non-sexual gender minorities. And then also, interestingly, if you look at whether or not people are residing in urban, suburban, or rural locations, you'll see that sexual and gender minority populations are far more likely to live in urban environments than non-sexual and gender minorities. And then also the same pattern, and you see that the difference there largely relates to as it relates to living in a rural location. We only have about 9% of sexual and gender minorities residing in rural places compared to about 14% of non-sexual gender minorities. All right, so here's the victimization data. So this is personal victimization rates. Now, victimization rates is the number of victimizations per 1,000 persons. So here, if you look at just total personal victimizations, sexual and gender minorities in these data have a victimization rate of 90.2 victimizations per 1,000 people, compared to non-sexual gender minorities having a 20.2 rate per 1,000 victimizations, and that difference is statistically significant, resulting in an odds ratio of about 5, suggesting that the victimization rate is 5 times larger for sexual and gender minorities as compared to non-sexual gender minorities. What's interesting here is that these disparities, these differences persist across a variety of types of violence. If you look at acts of serious violence, the rate is 35.2 compared to non-sexual gender minorities at 7.5. If you look at incidents of rape or sexual assault, you're having 14.5 victimizations per 1,000 persons for sexual and gender minorities compared to 1.8 victimizations for non-sexual gender minorities, leading to an odds ratio of 8.2. So 8 times greater for sexual and gender minorities than non-sexual and gender minorities. You can look at robbery, aggravated assault, acts of violence that involve a weapon, and across these categories, you see these disparities. You also see this in terms of simple assaults, where you have a victimization rate of 55 compared to 12.7. Sexual and gender minorities are also far more likely to, or have a greater rate of victimizations that result in an injury, and those disparities persist in those categories as well. Continuing on, so if we look at the victim-offender relationship, what we see is that there are disparities across a variety of categories. Sexual and gender minorities, 32.6 victimizations per 1,000 persons with someone who is well known to them, compared to 7.1 victimizations for non-sexual gender minorities. And that difference is statistically significant. We do see greater rates of victimization when it comes to intimate partner violence, with that being 12.8 compared to 2.9, and that difference is statistically significant. When it comes to relatives, we do see a disparity. It falls outside the traditional levels of statistical significance, but is not necessarily that far off. And then, of course, other well-known, we see this difference here. We do not see any significant differences if the offender is just a casual acquaintance. That difference is not significant. And then when it comes to violence perpetrated by strangers, we do see a disparity there, and that disparity does indicate that sexual and gender minorities, their victimization rates are 6 times higher than non-sexual gender minorities to be victimized by a stranger. And then we also do not see significant differences if the offender was just unknown. Now, if we subdivide this by gender, here we're just looking at different categories of personal victimization, but now we're looking among males and females and by sexual orientation and gender identity. One thing that I'll say is that in the rates of violent victimization among males is still disparate, but if you look among females, the rate of violent victimization is even larger. So here we're seeing about 47 violent victimizations per 1,000 persons for sexual and gender minority males. But we are seeing 127.7 violent victimizations per 1,000 persons for sexual and gender minority females. And that disparity is quite large, and these disparities tend to be statistically significant. For sexual and gender minority males have victimization rates of rape or sexual assault that are significantly higher than non-sexual and gender minority males. And then the pattern continues where sexual and gender minority females are at a far higher rate of experiencing rape or sexual assault than non-sexual and gender minority females. And you can see across varieties of crime, assaults, aggravated assaults, or simple assaults, that these differences exist. And so we're seeing, and then that the differences remain quite stark for sexual and gender minority females. Taking a look at property victimizations. So sexual and gender minorities are actually have a higher rate of property victimization as well. So here we're seeing 212.1 property victimizations per 1,000 households, compared to 106.1 property victimizations per 1,000 households for non-sexual gender minorities. So that's a victimization rate that's about 2.3 times higher. We're seeing that these differences are largely driven by household burglaries and other types of theft. We're not necessarily seeing a result of motor vehicle theft. And we as the research team thought this was interesting because if these systematic patterns are related to one's sexual orientation and gender identity, that maybe someone can target a house that is one that would be where a sexual and gender minority lives, but it may not necessarily be as readily apparent whether or not one's vehicle is owned by a sexual and gender minority. So we're trying to think through kind of the implications of these property victimization differences. Oh yeah, and this is only the 2017 data, just because I ran out of time to pool the 2 years together to produce these results. And then as a second note, that asterisk there indicates that that estimate might be based on 10 or fewer incidents, and so it might be unreliable. And anything that you saw, and none of the estimates produced thus far have been had that asterisk. So I just, now that that's being introduced to you, I just want to let you know that what that means on the table. Moving on. So let's just look at personal victimization rates. So this is all categories of violent victimization, but now looking at other demographic traits and categories. And so here what we're seeing is that disparities exist. The male, female we previously discussed in the previous slide, so I'm going to move right to race and ethnicity. What we're seeing is that disparities exist across numerous racial ethnic categories. What's interesting is that sexual and gender minorities who identify as Black have a slightly lower victimization rate compared to other other racial ethnic groups. And the difference between Black sexual gender minorities and Black non-sexual gender minorities is not statistically significant by traditional standards, but this may also be due to just the analysis being underpowered, because once you're thinking about subpopulations intersected with other subpopulations, the data get thinner. So hopefully with future years of data collection, we'll be able to more finely tune our more fine-grained analyses and have better powered analyses for these differences. But we do see that Latinos, sexual gender minorities are at a high risk of being victimized as compared to non-sexual gender minority Latinos. What's interesting as well is that we do see some age patterns here, where the disparity is quite consistent across age categories, but we do see that sexual and gender minorities in the 18 to 34-year-old range are the ones most likely to be at risk for violent victimization across other age strata. And then also between, say, 18 to 24 sexual gender minorities and 18 to 24-year-old non-sexual gender minorities. And those differences are statistically significant. And then you notice that the 16 to 17-year-olds, there is also a disparity. And while that disparity is not statistically significant, again, similar to what I said before, this is likely tied to just statistical power, because that subgroup is smaller than the overall sample. So other observations. So about 50% of the personal victimizations are reported to the police, and that is not difference by sexual orientation or gender identity. So we didn't see a significant difference in reporting to the police between sexual gender minorities and non-sexual gender minorities. Many of the disparities that I just presented to you persist after controlling for varieties of demographic characteristics. There are disparities in sexual gender minority victims suspecting their victimization was a hate crime. But it's important to note that in the NCBS, there is a question of whether or not you suspect it's a hate crime, but then there are follow-up questions about whether or not there was evidence that there was hate crime. And the Bureau of Justice Statistics has certain requirements in order for a type of crime to be categorized as a hate crime. And so while there are disparities in sexual gender minority victims thinking that what they experienced in terms of type of violence was a hate crime, if you actually look at if it's categorized as BJS categorized as hate crime, that we don't necessarily see disparities there. But among those hate crimes that are categorized by BJS as hate crimes, 90% of hate crimes are based on sexuality and gender for sexual and gender minorities versus 19% for non-sexual and gender minorities. Moving forward, so let's look at subgroups by sexual orientation. And here we're seeing, you're seeing all the types of personal victimization, but now subdivided by straight men, gay men, and bisexual men. And what you'll see is that the disparities persist, and actually the disparity is larger in terms of personal victimization for bisexual men than for gay men. So bisexual men have a violent victimization rate of 76.7 victimizations per 1,000 persons compared to 38.6 victimizations per 1,000 persons for gay men and 19.4 for straight men. And again, if you see an asterisk near any estimate, that asterisk indicates that the estimate may be unreliable due to sample size issues. If you see a little a next to a number, that A indicates that there was a statistically significant difference with straight men. If you see a B in the bisexual men column, that suggests that the victimization rate is significantly different from bisexual men and gay men. And we see patterns here. For sake of time, I'm going to move beyond this slide, but if you want to return to it and discuss any of these other patterns that you see, we can definitely do so. Moving over to sexual orientation by females, we do see differences in victimization if you look among straight women, lesbians, and bisexual women. And the stark standout point here is that bisexual women are far more likely to have higher victimization rates than lesbians or straight women. And there are significant differences for bisexual women across numerous categories of crime from both lesbians and straight women. And so here, bisexual women have a victimization rate, a violent victimization rate of 189.1 victimizations per 1,000 persons, where the rate is 78.4 for lesbians and 21 for straight women. And this also includes incidents of rape or sexual assault, where bisexual women are far more likely to be or have a far higher rate of violent victimization or of rape or sexual assault victimizations than other women in these data. And that if you look at intimate partner violence, that it's far higher for bisexual women than other categories. So if you look at the overall sexual and gender minority group in terms of what is potentially what is some of the factors that are leading to these great disparities, one of the biggest factors is what is happening to bisexual women. If we look at gender identity, we do see disparities in victimization rates. The personal victimization rate for transgender people is 86.2 victimizations per 1,000 persons, compared to 21.7 for cisgender people. If we look at this broken down by gender assigned at birth, we do see that the victimization rate is high for both transgender people who are assigned male at birth and transgender people who are assigned female at birth. The 86.1 for transgender people assigned male at birth is based on a smaller sample, and which is why it's reflected in a larger confidence interval. So the disparity that we see between cisgender people and transgender people for among those assigned male at birth is not statistically significant, but it is approaching traditional levels of significance. For transgender people assigned female at birth, that disparity is statistically significant. And we also see disparities in terms of property victimization rates, where the property victimization rate for transgender people And here we're saying if a transgender household is a household that has at least one transgender person. And so a transgender households have a property victimization rate of 214 compared to 108 for households that do not have a transgender person. And we see that these differences are starkest or largest for households that have a transgender person assigned female at birth in the house. So the next question, of course, is the so what? What are the policy implications? The documentation of violence from population-based data can be important to policymaking to enact, quote, more effective and necessary policies at the local, state, and federal levels to protect people based on their sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. Anti-violence programs should consider and need to consider further sexual orientation and gender identity, particularly for the most vulnerable subpopulations within these groups. And then future work may want to investigate geographic variation and socio-political climate toward LGBTQ people. This in terms of thinking about public policies that are in place and practices that are in place that might reduce the disparities that we see in these data. There are, of course, limitations. Sample sizes do not permit finer-grained analyses for populations that we suspect are at greater risk. The survey mode is in personal interviews, and the survey sponsor, the federal government, may affect the prevalence rates for LGBT people. The percent was 2.1% in these data, where if you look at other data sources like the Gallup organization, you normally see percentages at 4.5%. So there is that difference, and that difference might be in part the survey mode and the survey sponsor. Though I will say that there was a paper published by members of the Bureau of Justice Statistics comparing their prevalence rate to other federal surveys, and that their percentages are not too different from what the federal government produces in those areas. So they're pretty confident in their measure of these items. So now to link this to the 2020 election and future SOGI data collection. This is important. Starting in 2019, the Department of Justice and Bureau of Justice Statistics announced that they would stop SOGI data collection on people aged below 18. So we will no longer obtain data for people aged 16 and 17. Additionally, a change was also made to the NCBS such that sexual orientation and gender identity is only asked among victims and not the full sample. So the results that I presented to you today in terms of victimization rates will not be able to be updated or reproduced with future data. Because in order to get victimization rates, you have to know who is a sexual and gender minority in the entire population or in the full sample in order to understand how many victimizations there were or how many sexual and gender minorities there are in the population. So that is going to hinder what we can learn and understand about the disparities of victimization for sexual and gender minorities. And this does reflect other federal data collection efforts that have started to roll back data collection on these topics. And that is the end of my presentation, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew. That was powerful and sobering at the same time. We have half a dozen questions lined up. Let us start with Scott Siegel.
Oh, sorry. Hi, Andrew. It was really, really amazing presentation. And my question is really based on almost the last two slides or the last slide. And actually just to go back in time and tell us a little bit about why this report was gathered in general. Like, why did the government think it was important to start collecting data on victimization rates among sexual minorities? What pressure groups were involved, or what thinking did the government have in order to collect it? And then maybe talk a little bit about the last slide and why you think that has changed. Who is responsible for no longer collecting data correctly on sexual minority violence?
Thank you. Yeah. So the story of how this all happened, right, is definitely one that it reflects years of lobbying work, both within numerous federal agencies as well as kind of outside pressure from various groups. The Williams Institute has advocated for a very long time the inclusion of sexuality and gender across numerous surveys in order for us to get a better understanding of these topics, right? And so, when these changes were being made in the current administration, we co-signed and submitted numerous statements because many of these changes have to go through public comment. And so we did try and make the case that there was no reason why the government should stop or roll back its data collection efforts. I'm not the best person to say, here's what happened behind closed doors or behind the scenes on these matters. And I'm sure that if you were to talk to folks at the Bureau of Justice Statistics, that they might tell you in an unofficial capacity kind of the stories of how these things happened, but they might not necessarily tell you in terms of their official capacities. I'll note that even the Bureau of Justice Statistics, like the NCBS, is a complex survey to analyze. And even the measures of the types of victimizations, they don't even supply to you, well, not in a publicly available resource, the codes to actually create these, like to categorize these crimes these types of ways. It's through personal communications that I was able to kind of obtain these things, so that way I could reproduce results that would be consistent with what BJS would produce. And there is a reason why an independent academic team is presenting these results to you and not the Bureau of Justice Statistics. So, so I'll emphasize that as well. They could be the ones reporting these findings out, but they have not indicated that they are going to produce any kind of specialized report looking at sexual and gender diverse populations and their incidents of victimization.
So next up, Joseph Anthony.
Hey everyone, hello. Andrew, thank you so much for your talk. Very informative. As Reynolds said, sobering, but obviously very, very important information. So I'm wondering if you all have any state breakdowns on these data, or perhaps regional breakdowns. A common assumption, though maybe it's busted, but a common presumption might be that rates are more disparate, or we see higher rates of violence, say in the American South versus the North or West. I'm just wondering if you have that sort of data, and if you all have done any breakdowns.
Thanks for that. So we could do region as the broad categories of census region. We have not actually looked at it though, so I can crunch the numbers for, quickly, and I can follow up with you in private email about what those look like. But in terms of state level measures, the state is actually restricted data in the NCBS. And so in order to obtain that data, you actually have to go to the US Census Bureau's research data centers, which there are, I think, 5, I don't know, there are just a few across the country, one's at UCLA, one's of course here in DC. But you actually have to go through an application process. And in that application process, you actually have to convincingly tell the US Census Bureau how you're improving them do their work. And so you just can't say, I have a research question and need to gain access to these data to answer that research question. You actually have to show how you're helping the Census Bureau. And it can be a timely process, can take over a year to gain access to those data. But I do want to say that in terms of research agenda and where I want to go in this area, I do want to do some state level work. And so we'll need to begin the process of gaining access to this work, particularly because there's been this ongoing, and I'll say myth, of the relationship between accommodations protections with gender identity and victimization. And so the NCBS as a whole can help inform that question, but then we can also start thinking about more nuanced victimizations in terms of place and space.
Great. Now let's take a question from Sam Ritzels.
Hi, I don't know if I have my camera on, but if you can see me, great. Thank you so much, Andrew, for such an interesting presentation. I have just a question of clarification, which is just, when you were saying sexual and gender minority females, would that mean people like trans men who are assigned female at birth? I was just trying to follow that in the presentation itself. And then my two just broader questions, one of them is, I didn't see, and perhaps I missed it, but I didn't see anything on income. And so I was wondering if there's any other like socioeconomic details that were provided, or if education was used as a proxy for that. That's one thing. And then the reason why I was asking that is because even with education, there can be marginalization from formal employment. But then the second thing I was just wondering, and perhaps this is me getting ahead of myself, is just now with all this information, you were talking about this myth or a potential myth around, I guess, security and housing. But the data that you presented itself was actually, it almost challenged a lot of assumptions that we have in our community about who the most vulnerable are. And so I was wondering if there are any big takeaways or I guess, analytical trends that you're working with in these papers that you might want to be able to present to us, or just, I guess, a little bit more of analysis that you're thinking in terms of all this really striking data. Thank you.
Thank you. So when I say sexual gender minority female, it is looking at sexual and gender minority persons whose gender assigned at birth was female, and similarly for males. In terms of income, income is definitely in the data. So, and we do present results in the main paper on the income distribution of sexual and gender minorities. I don't know if I could pull it up really quickly. But we did see kind of an income skew, in which that if you look at the lower income brackets, there were some differences between sexual gender minorities and non-sexual gender minorities, where sexual gender minorities had higher levels of lower income brackets. But then we also saw the converse as well. So if you look at the top at the higher end, that it wasn't that large of a difference, but there was a difference where sexual and gender minorities had higher incomes than non-sexual gender minorities in those brackets. So it's kind of like this bipolar pattern in the data. And then when I talk about when we control, so in the multiple regression framework, we do control for household income as a covariate. So it's not just education that works as a proxy there. So we definitely did that. And then to the last question about kind of who's most vulnerable and how these data might challenge certain narratives. I think it complements some areas of narratives, actually. Sexual violence toward bisexual women was documented in a prior study. And so that we find that pattern here just like replicates and confirms that those patterns of violence do exist. And then, of course, since this is a survey, these are all victimizations that are non-fatal, right? And so I think we should buttress any of these findings with acknowledging that there are types of violence and murders that happen that skew across sexual and gender minority groups differently, right? And so that is a type of crime that is not necessarily assessed with these data. So I think it's I don't know if I'm necessarily fully challenging a lot of of our common wisdom, but I think what we're doing here is we're kind of indicating that we've always suspected, at least, that there would be a greater risk for sexual and gender minority populations to be at risk for violence. And now we actually have empirical data that shows it, and then shows it across a wide varieties of crime.
Wonderful. Now next up is Haley Norris.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing all this information. I'm still trying to process all the data that you just gave us. I have a general question, which is how much do you think we can generalize from this information that was collected in a really particular sort of moment of backlash politically? Specifically, I'm thinking about the property crimes. And I also wanted to know if you guys had looked at the relationship between property crimes and geographic area in terms of urban or rural or suburban, just to see if there's something else maybe to explain why those property crimes are so much higher. And I also was wondering if there's a question about re-victimization in the survey, just to know who's actually being impacted multiple times. Thank you.
Right. No, yeah, thank you for those questions. Yeah, it's interesting because we only have 2 years of data, that in terms of trying to think about had this been 2014, 2015, and not 2017, 2018 would be finding different patterns, right? What I can say is that if you just looked at the 2017 data and just the 2018 data, that they're rather consistent. In terms of, like I had no concern or very little concern pooling those years of data in order to gain sufficient sample sizes, particularly for our transgender subsample. But it would be interesting to think about what these trends might be as time goes forward. The unfortunate thing, as I said, is that due to the changes that the federal government has made, is that we're not going to be able to get trends in victimization rates. It's just not going to be possible until the Bureau of Justice Statistics changes its practices to keep sexual orientation and gender identity on the basic demographic questionnaire. And so it's going to be difficult. We will be able to, not all is lost. We will be able to say, among those who had a violent victimization, or among those who had a property victimization, what % of those victimizations were, say, aggravated assaults, right? What % of those were other types of crime? We just won't be able to get that victimization rate. And so it's like, oh, you might be able to say, oh, it's interesting, sexual gender minorities are, of their violent victimizations, 12% of them are sexual assaults, whereas for non-sexual minorities, only 6% of their victimizations are sexual assaults. But that difference is not necessarily the key difference that we necessarily want to care about, right? So that's what I wanted. It's like, it's so frustrating about those changes to the federal government. In terms of property victimization and urban, suburban, rural, or say region, we haven't looked into that yet. I'm making note. So the fun thing, here's the thing. It's like, we're trying to set out the core knowledge base, right? And then it's kind of like, then what? And so there's so many things to explore and examine and consider, right? So I'm making notes so that way I can go back to the research team and we can kind of think and consider and put our heads together to get a more fine-grained assessment. So one thing that we're doing right now is that we're considering a more finer-grained and thorough paper on race and ethnicity because we think that's a very important dimension to consider and to gain greater understanding of. And then, yes, it is on my agenda as well to think about repeat offenses or repeat victimization. Are the disparities that we're seeing, is it that it's one individual who is being victimized numerous times? And we do have a measure in the NCBS in terms of the number of victimizations. It is top coded though, so if someone is victimized more than 10 times, it's top coded to 10. And flagged that way. So, and because these and they do that because they've been doing it they've been documenting this for so long that, it's highly unlikely that you're going to have someone reporting such victimizations beyond 10. So, but if you're ever interested in all those details, the NCBS code books are actually quite thorough, so you can get all those definitions.
Okay, let's move to Tariq Abu Chadi.
Hi, I also thought this was a really fascinating talk and really interesting findings. I had 2 points. The first was on a bit of theorizing around the huge variation that you find among several groups. And I was wondering if you have some avenues where you think, okay, this is where we're going. It's, for example, differences in targeting and motivation for this targeting. And I also thought that the finding on the car theft was really interesting for exactly the same reason that you said, because then it's maybe much more difficult to actually target sexual minorities or gender minorities. Second point, with the effects for the bisexuals, I was wondering how much that is driven by age, because you showed before that actually identifying as bisexual is strongly correlated with age, and age also is correlated with the incidence rates.
Yeah, thanks for that questions. In terms of the victimization rates and its relationship to age, the bisexual victimizations do not substantially differ once you say condition on age. So not saying that the disparity doesn't exist. I'm saying that the victimization rates that are presented today don't change much if you produce a victimization rate adjusted for age. So a lot of the patterns that we see are pretty robust to, say, making an adjustment. So and I just didn't present the adjusted rates just because it's a huge presentation already. Yes, and then in terms of theorizing, I think that the stigma framework and minority stress framework are helpful in terms of having us think through kind of both the broad patterns of violence that we see directed towards sexual gender minorities, but then also how we can think more across intersecting and intersectional categories in terms of thinking why certain groups are at greater risk. But we definitely have to do more thinking on those matters. This is why I said we have a paper that's going to be devoted strictly toward race and ethnicity, because we want to do a greater and more thoughtful theoretical foreground in order to be able to contextualize those patterns and those results. So we are moving forward in those directions, but we did feel like the sense of urgency to get the first cut of the data out. And so, like I said, I'm hopeful that the results will be accepted and interesting. But no, we are definitely headed toward a more theoretical direction in those. I think that was all your questions. If I missed something, I'm sorry.
Okay, Andrew, we have 3 more questions to face. Next one is from Gabrielle.
Andrew, thank you for this very powerful presentation. I have a question that is to some extent related to the previous one, and I wanted to ask if you have some possible explanation or speculation for why the victimization rate among sexual and gender minorities is very high for young people, 18 to 34. And then if you could say something more about why violence against the bisexual women is especially high when we look at intimate partner. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's, thank you. So in terms of the age patterns, it's just important to note that if you look at the victimization rates across age, that as one gets older, the likelihood that one is a victim just decreases in the population. And so just younger populations are just more likely to be victims of crime. And I think those patterns are reflected in numerous of the reports that the Bureau of Justice Statistics produce. And that might be related to a lot of situations of being a younger person in society, particularly in terms of housing stability, and other situations and situational factors that might lead to a greater risk, right? But that we do see the disparity, that the disparities are large for that category, I think fits that narrative of just that younger persons are more likely to be victims. So if we see disparities in the population, if we look at that age subpopulations, that where the disparities would be most likely to be highest are the populations where you're more likely to see victimization occur. And then, let's see, remind me of your second question, sorry.
Bisexual women and intimate partner violence.
Yeah. Well, as I said before, there have been studies and work on that area, both in a quantitative and in a qualitative fashion. And those studies continue to find disparities for bisexual women in terms of intimate partner violence. So those studies kind of provide a greater context and maybe theoretical foreground as to why, especially if those qualitative works can kind of give you more of that contextual narrative. But I will say that we went into analyzing this data based on that literature to foreground an expectation that we would see those disparities for bisexual women, and so that they panned out kind of complements what other research studies have shown. So in terms of a broader theory, I'll just point to those other sources to kind of identify how those contextual factors differ for bisexual women as others. Yeah.
Okay, so we have 2 more questions. Let's take Michael Pometry.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you so much. My question was about whether you had access to data on, or whether the questions in the survey were specifically about crimes in the previous year or in the past 5 years, and whether you have access to data on the timing of the crime that was committed. Because like you said, you know, without sort of a long time series, you can't really do these trend analyses. But if you can get at, you know, the time that the crime took place, you might have some leverage on that. And in particular, I'm curious whether, you know, some of these crimes took place many years ago, perhaps, you know, because closeted individuals are perhaps more targeted by crime. And I'm also interested about the rates of crime by disability status and marital status as well, but those are separate questions.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. We might be able to say something about unmarried sexual and gender minorities, but because, as you saw in the presentation, the distribution for by marital status is that only 25% of the sample would be married for sexual and gender minorities, and then if you look at just among victims, it might be a small slice. So, but let me be clear a little bit more about what the NCVS does. So the NCVS does an intake survey when you're first impaneled and asks about your history of violence and past experiences. And that's used as a benchmark and washout. So that way, when they interview you again, it's asking you for what happened to you in the last 6 months. So this is not violence, lifetime violence. This is violence that occurred within these 2 years. And they have pretty strong controls to make sure that they're not picking up incidents that happened several years ago. So they try and screen that out. In terms of other forms of timing, I don't think there is a specific day, but we could look at broader types of time in terms of, say, month or I don't think we have week. I have to see. But we do have, which is interesting, when in the time of day did an incident occur. So you could actually look at, like, did the incidents occur more at night or more during the morning? And you also have space. Did this incident occur at home, at work, in some public venue versus somewhere else? And so there's numerous potential details that can be uncovered to more greatly kind of characterize the nature of victimization across these categories.
Great. And let's go to the last question, which is Liz Barker.
Andrew, thank you so much for a really fascinating presentation. The data was just wonderful. I'm going to ask you a question, and I do so as the proud patron of the Albert Kennedy Trust, which is an LGBT youth homelessness charity here in the United Kingdom. And something which the charity is reporting to me and we're trying to make a case for in Parliament is to change the definition of domestic violence to include parental violence. Because at the moment, domestic violence is really only about partner violence. And I wondered, from your age breakdown on the personal violence and everything, did you pick up anything in your data that would be an indicator of that?
I haven't looked into that, so but we can. So here we could actually investigate, because they do ask you a relationship to the offender. And how I presented it is just how the Bureau of Justice Statistics presents it. But I can actually look at, was the perpetrator a parent or step-parent? And then also look at that by age categories. So I don't have the answer for you, but I can say that the answer is obtainable. And so maybe just like the other one, I can circle back with you via email just to tell you what that shows.
Wonderful. Okay, let me close by first thanking all of you for joining us today. I quite like the 1 hour slot. I know it's a little shorter than some, but I think it's a productive way of spending our lunch times or evening times. I should also thank greatly Andrew Flores for putting together another fabulous presentation. His work is so important and so cutting edge in the best sense of the term. And I really learn a lot from that. I would say, and leave out a question on the table that is not for Andrew to answer now, but for all of us to think about. I wonder, on the flip side of the data about the prevalence of crime, whether there's data on sentencing disparities. That if you are convicted of crimes that relate to sexual minorities, is there a disparity in the treatment of the perpetrators of those crimes? And I think that would be a sort of reinforcing layer of discrimination that I would sort of be even more concerned about as well. I should announce.
I was going to say, if you want a really nice review, the 2017 article that I quoted earlier by Jordan Blair Woods, titled LGBT Identity and Crime, talks about victimization, offending, as well as what happens in juries. And so, but basically emphasizes what we don't know as much as what we can know. So, but if you want a nice review, that was very helpful for me.
Oh, that's great. No, thank you. That's really useful. Let me just say that next week we have Lee Badgett from UMass Amherst talking about the impacts of discrimination on the economy and the involvement of LGBTQ people in the economy, which she just has a recent book out, which is really the gold standard in that field. So keep well for the next week and beyond, and we shall see as many of you as possible next Thursday. So thank you and goodbye.